In the summer of 1987, my grandmother thought it'd be a good idea for us to go camping. She said I needed to spend more time outdoors instead of sitting inside playing video games. I didn't really mind. She had an old beat-up tent, a rusty lantern, and a cooler packed with sandwiches. This kind of trip was right up her alley, simple and no extras. We drove out to a state park that was about 2 hours from our house. We set up our tent near a lake in a spot where only a few other people were camping, scattered far enough away that it felt like we were alone. The first day was normal. We walked around checking out some trails, ate sandwiches by the water, and I helped her build a small fire. As the sun went down, the woods around us got dark fast. The trees swallowed up the last bits of light, and soon it was just the fire and the stars. I was used to it being that dark, but my grandmother didn't seem to care. She was a tough woman, never afraid of anything. That night, though, I couldn't sleep. The forest was alive with strange sounds, branches cracking, leaves rustling, and what I swore sounded like footsteps far off in the distance. I kept telling myself it was just animals, but something about it didn't feel right. I lay there for hours, staring up at the inside of the tent, listening to every little noise. My grandmother slept peacefully next to me, breathing slow and steady in her sleeping bag, totally unaware. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was just letting my imagination get to me. We spent the day fishing and cooking over the fire, but when the sun went down, the noises came back, and this time they were closer. I lay in my sleeping bag, my heart racing as I listened to the sounds outside the tent. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there watching us from the darkness. By the third night, I was on edge. Every little sound made me jump. I tried to act like it was all in my head, but the feeling wouldn't go away. After we got into our sleeping bags, I lay there trying to calm myself down. Then I heard it again, a soft, slow crunching of leaves right outside the tent. My whole body tensed up. I stopped breathing, straining my ears to listen. The footsteps were slow, almost careful, like whoever it was didn't want to be noticed. They circled around the tent close enough that I could feel the ground move under me. I didn't dare move. I wanted to wake my grandmother, but I was too scared to even whisper. The footsteps stopped right next to my side of the tent, and for a long moment everything went quiet. Then something pressed against the side of the tent right where my head was. I felt it drag down slowly, like a hand brushing along the fabric. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I lay there frozen, waiting for whatever it was to make its next move. After what felt like forever, the sound of footsteps came back, this time moving away from the tent. I didn't move for a long time, just staring into the darkness, too afraid to close my eyes. I must have eventually passed out from exhaustion, but it wasn't restful. The next morning I woke up to the smell of coffee. My grandmother was already outside stirring the fire like nothing had happened. I got dressed quickly and stepped out of the tent. My mind was racing, going over everything from the night before. I walked around the tent looking for any sign of what had been out there. At first everything seemed normal, just leaves and dirt, but then I saw them, deep footprints in the ground, much too big to be from any animal. They led from the woods straight to our tent and stopped exactly where I'd felt the pressure on the fabric. But it wasn't the footprints that made my stomach turn, it was the fact that they didn't lead back into the woods. There were no tracks leaving our campsite, just the ones that came in. Something or someone had walked up to our tent and never left. I didn't say anything to my grandmother. We packed up camp and left that morning. I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints on the drive home. No matter how hard I tried to forget, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something had been there with us, watching us. And to this day, every time I think about that night, I wonder where they went, or worse, if they're still out there following me, waiting for the right time to come back. We were camped out in the middle of nowhere for a training exercise deep in the mountains. It was supposed to be an easy army trip, nothing big. We set up our tents close to the woods where the trees were thick and the air felt cold. You could smell the pine trees all around us. It was so quiet out there that you could almost forget how far we were from anything. The first night went all right. We did the usual stuff, set up our tents, ate some quick meals, and kept watch around the camp. But by the second night, something didn't feel right. It wasn't the usual feeling of being out in the wild, it was different, like something was off, but I couldn't figure out what. I was on guard duty walking, looking around the camp when I started hearing noises. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it didn't sound like that. It was more like someone or something moving around in the woods just outside of where the trees started. I looked into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The moonlight barely got through the branches, making it tough to see far into the forest. I told myself it was probably just animals. Still, that creepy feeling stuck with me the rest of the night. When my shift ended, I went back to my tent, but I couldn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, it felt like someone was watching me. By the third night, everyone else seemed tense too. No one was saying anything, but I could tell the way they moved, the way they kept looking at the woods. It was clear something was bothering them. The air felt heavier that night, like something was in the woods keeping an eye on us. That night I heard the noise again. This time it was closer. I grabbed my gear and stepped out of my tent. Some of the others were already awake, standing by the campfire looking into the trees. I knew they had heard it too. We all stood still listening. The sound came again, moving closer. It wasn't an animal. Whatever was out there was bigger, and it was moving slowly, like it didn't want us to hear it. My heart was racing as I stared into the trees, trying to see what it was, but I couldn't make out anything. Then behind me I heard something in the bushes. I turned quickly, ready for anything, but there was nothing there, just the dark woods. Everything had gone quiet again, too quiet. We didn't sleep that night. We all stayed up watching, waiting, but nothing else happened. No more sounds, no movement, just silence. By morning we were worn out, but we had orders to stay another night. We couldn't leave yet. As the sun went down again, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was going to be worse. And it was just after midnight the noises started again, but this time they were coming from all around us. Whatever was out there was circling our camp, staying just out of sight. My stomach turned, and I knew this wasn't normal. There was no way it was just animals. Then there was a loud crash, like something big had hit the ground hard not far from where we were. I felt my blood run cold. We rushed toward the sound, our flashlights cutting through the dark. But there was nothing, no tracks, no signs of anything. Whatever it was gone. We didn't wait for the morning. We packed up and got out of there before the sun came up, ending the training early. The higher-ups didn't say anything about what happened, just told us to move out. I didn't ask any questions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew something we didn't. Whatever was out there in those woods, it was watching us the whole time, waiting. And I don't think it was just the wind that kept me awake those nights. There was something out there, something real, something we couldn't see, and I think we left just before it was ready to show itself. I had gone camping a few times before, but never like this. This spot was way deeper in the woods than I had ever been. I wanted some time alone, away from the noise and people, and this seemed like the perfect place. I parked my car at the edge of a small open area, grabbed my stuff, and set up camp. By the time it was late afternoon, everything was set. The tent was up. I had gathered enough firewood, and I started a small fire to keep the chill away. As the sun started to go down, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, no sounds from the bushes, just nothing. I had hoped for some peace, but this silence felt weird, almost too heavy. I tried to ignore the strange feeling and focused on making my dinner. The fire crackled as I ate, but the strange feeling stuck with me. I kept glancing into the woods, expecting to see something moving, but there was nothing, at least not yet. It got dark faster than I thought it would. I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. Usually when I camp, the sounds of the forest help me fall asleep, but tonight it felt off. It was way too quiet. I closed my eyes, trying to force myself to sleep, but every small sound outside made my heart race. A twig snapping, leaves rustling, normal sounds in the woods, but tonight they felt different, like they were too close. Hours passed, and I was finally starting to doze off when I woke up. Suddenly my heart was pounding, and I wasn't sure why. It wasn't a noise that woke me, it was the lack of it. There was no wind, no animal sounds, nothing. I lay there listening, trying to hear anything outside the tent, and that's when I felt that something was out there. I don't know how I knew, but I could feel it. My skin went cold and I broke into a sweat. I stayed completely still, trying not to breathe too loud. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Then I heard a soft crunch of leaves, like footsteps, slow and steady, moving around my tent. Someone or something was walking out there. My heart raced as I listened, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The steps circled the tent once, then again, then they stopped. The silence after that was worse than the sound of the footsteps. I didn't dare move. I lay there frozen in fear, every second dragging on like it would never end. After what felt like for forever, the footsteps started again, but this time they moved away deeper into the woods. I stayed still for a long time, too scared to do anything. Eventually, I worked up the courage to unzip the tent just a little and peek outside. There was nothing there, no one. I didn't sleep at all after that. I kept waiting to hear those footsteps again or to see something moving outside the tent, but nothing happened. When the sun finally came up, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my stuff as fast as I could and threw everything into my car. As I was driving away, something caught my eye. At the edge of the clearing where the woods began, footprints, not animal tracks, but human ones. They led into the trees and disappeared. The thought hit me hard. Whoever had been out there had been watching me. They knew I was there. They had circled my tent, listening to me, waiting for something. I pressed down on the gas, wanting to get out of there as quickly as possible. The whole drive home, my heart wouldn't stop pounding. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there all night watching me. I checked my rear-view mirror more times than I'd like to admit. Even though I was miles away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, maybe even following me. As I drove, I couldn't help but wonder if I had been watched the whole time I was out there. Even before I heard those footsteps, I had been traveling around Italy for a while, and after a few weeks of seeing the sights, I needed a break from the crowded cities. I found a quiet campsite near the mountains, far from any main road or towns. The area was calm, tall trees surrounded a small open space, and a thin stream ran along the edge of the site. It seemed like the perfect spot to unwind for a couple of nights. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and sat back to enjoy the peacefulness. The first day went by smoothly. I spent the afternoon walking around, listening to the sounds of the forest and the occasional bird off in the distance. As the sun went down, everything got quiet, almost too quiet. But I brushed it off, telling myself I was just overthinking it. That night I woke up to a strange noise outside the tent. At first I thought it was an animal. Wild boar or deer were common in this part of the country, so I wasn't too worried, but the sound was odd, like something heavy being dragged across the dirt, slow and steady. I listened for a while, my heart racing a little, but eventually the noise stopped and I fell back asleep. The next morning I walked around the area looking for any signs of what might have made the noise. I couldn't find anything out of the ordinary, so I figured maybe I had dreamed it. I spent the day hiking a bit further up into the mountains, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Something about the quietness of the woods, how empty and still it felt, made me uncomfortable. That night I went into my tent earlier, hoping a good night's sleep would help me forget about it, but in the middle of the night I woke up again to the same sound. This time it was even closer, right outside the tent, a slow, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I stayed still, listening, barely breathing. The sound slowly moved around the tent, circling it. I could feel the ground slightly shaking beneath me. With each pass felt like it went on forever. Finally the sound faded away into the woods. I stayed awake until the sun came up, listening, but the forest had gone dead silent again. The next morning I decided I'd had enough and wanted to leave early. As I was taking down my tent, I noticed Something strange in the dirt around where my tent had been. There were deep, smooth grooves like something heavy had been dragged around the campsite. The marks were wide and didn't look natural. There were no footprints or signs of any animals, just the strange dragging lines that led into the woods. Curious, I followed the trail. It led deeper into the forest, weaving between the trees. I walked for a while, until I came to a small clearing. The first, there didn't seem to be anything there, just an empty patch of dirt, but then I saw a large heavy stone, smooth and round, sitting in the middle of the clearing. The ground around it was messed up, like the stone had been dragged through the dirt, just like the marks back at my campsite. It didn't make any sense. There was no reason for it to be here, no sign of people, no explanation for how such a huge stone could have moved. It looked like someone or something had been dragging it through the forest. I backed away, my heart pounding, and hurried back to the campsite. As I packed up my gear, my hands were shaking. I just wanted to get out of there. As I was finishing up, I heard it again, the dragging noise, faint but growing louder, coming from the direction of the clearing. It was heading my way. I didn't look back. I grabbed my stuff and took off, walking as fast as I could without running. I didn't stop until I was far away from that place. I don't know what I saw, and I don't know what was out there with me, but the way that stone had been moved, the way that sound followed me. I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't human. Something was watching me, something that didn't want me to see it, and I still wonder what might have happened if I hadn't left when I did. I'm a Canadian cop, and last summer I decided to spend a weekend camping alone in the wild. I picked a secluded spot deep in the woods, far from any trails, hoping for some real peace and quiet. The place was beautiful, tall pines, a calm lake, and just the sounds of the forest. I set up my tent and started a fire to cook dinner. As the sun went down, the forest grew dark, and the usual quiet was sometimes broken by the sound of leaves rustling. I felt pretty relaxed, knowing I was ready for anything, and used to being out here alone. Around midnight, I was woken up by a soft, steady tapping on my tent. At first, I thought it was just branches moving in the wind, or maybe a small animal, but then the tapping got louder and more rhythmic. It was coming from different sides of the tent, and it felt too organized to be random. My instincts kicked in, and I grabbed my flashlight and gun. Even though I was off duty, I slowly unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight around. There was nothing there. The forest was quiet. I stepped outside and checked the area. Everything seemed fine, but I noticed something odd. The ground around my tent was disturbed, like someone had walked around it carefully, staying out of the light from the fire. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay cool. I decided to check it out, keeping my flashlight and gun ready. As I walked around, I found small footprints in the dirt, bare footprints. They were fresh, and the fact that there were no shoes meant someone had been trying hard to stay hidden. I followed the tracks, keeping my distance and moving quietly. They led me to the edge of the lake, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. Across the lake, I saw a figure standing among the trees, barely visible in the dim light. The figure didn't move, almost like it was watching me. A chill went down my spine. I knew I had to get out of there. I hurried back to my camp, packed up quickly, and got into my vehicle. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone behind me. The figure was gone, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. Back home, I reported the strange events to the local police, but no one was ever found in that area. The footprints and the odd disturbances around my tent were never explained. It was a harsh reminder that even in the most isolated places, you're never truly alone. The unsettling reality is that someone or something was out there watching and waiting. My mom and I planned a camping trip by this quiet lake we'd been to before. It wasn't far, only an hour's drive from home, deep in the woods. We liked it because it was calm and no one else went there, so we felt safe even though it was far from everything. The first day went smoothly. We set up the tent, got a fire going, and spent the day sitting by the water. The air was fresh and it was quiet, not a single person around for miles. Felt nice, like we had the whole place to ourselves. When night came, we climbed into our sleeping bags. I could hear the soft sounds of the forest outside, leaves rustling, a few crickets. It helped me fall asleep fast. But sometime during the night, I woke up. The fire had gone out and it was completely dark inside the tent. The only light came from the moon outside. But even that was faint. As I lay there, I heard a noise outside the tent. At first I thought it was just the wind in the trees, but then I realized it was something else, something closer. It sounded like something moving through the bushes near us. I stayed still, listening hard, trying to figure out what it was. My heart was beating fast, but I didn't want to move. Then I heard it again, a dragging sound, low and slow, like something was being pulled across the ground. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or some animal, but the noise kept coming closer, slowly making its way around the tent. I looked at my mom, who was still asleep next to me. I didn't want to wake her up and make her scared if it was nothing, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. Suddenly the tent moved. It wasn't a big movement, just a slight push, but enough to make my stomach twist. Whatever was out there had brushed against the side of the tent. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. I didn't move, just listening, waiting for it to happen again. But nothing happened for a while. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard soft footsteps, faint at first, then getting quieter as they moved back into the woods. I lay there, eyes wide open, not daring to close them again. I stayed like that until morning, listening to every little noise, waiting for it to come back, but it never did. By the time the sun came up, I had almost convinced myself. I imagined that maybe it was just the wind after all, or maybe I was dreaming and woke up in the middle of it. My mom didn't say anything about hearing noises, so I didn't bring it up. We spent the day fishing and hiking, but I couldn't shake this feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I looked at the trees, I felt like there were eyes on us, like someone or something was watching. But I kept quiet. I didn't want to scare my mom or ruin the trip. The second night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow seemed bigger. I lay there with my eyes open most of the night, just waiting, but nothing happened. It was almost too quiet, and that made me even more nervous. When the morning came, I felt a wave of relief. We packed up quickly, eager to get out of there. As we loaded up the car, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Right outside where our tent had been, there were deep, long drag marks in the dirt. They led from the trees right up to our tent and then back into the woods. I didn't say anything to my mom, but I couldn't stop staring at those marks. They were way too big to be from any animal. I knew it looked like something heavy had been dragged around our tent in the middle of the night. Right when I heard those sounds, we left, and as we drove off, I kept looking back at the woods, expecting to see someone or something standing at the edge watching us go. But there was nothing. The trees looked empty now. Every time I think about that night, I feel a deep chill run down my spine. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just passing by. It had come right up to our tent, close enough to touch us, and it left without a trace. But the worst part, one can't stop wondering why it left, or if it'll come back the next time someone camps there. I decided to take my stepbrother Mark out for a camping trip. We were both excited about it. The plan was to head to a remote spot deep in the woods, far from other people. I thought it would be a good chance for us to bond and escape our busy lives. We got to the site in the early afternoon. It was a quiet, out-of-the-way place by a small lake surrounded by thick trees. The place was perfect, isolated, peaceful, and far from any other campers. We set up our tent, built a fire, and spent the evening cooking over it. The night was cool, but nothing too unusual. Around midnight, after Mark had fallen asleep, I was lying in the tent looking at the faint light of the lantern. The sounds of the forest were soothing, except for one thing, a steady, distant thud. It sounded like someone was hitting something, or a muffled drum beat. At first I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just an echo or some animal, but as the hours went by, the sound got louder and more urgent. It was coming from the direction of the trees not far from our campsite. I tried to wake Mark, but he was deep in sleep, and shaking him only made him mumble, feeling more curious and uneasy. I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and Stepped outside. The night was dark and the thing seemed to grow louder as I walked toward the forest. My flashlight cut through the darkness, casting creepy shadows on the trees. The thud was now mixed with a strange scraping noise. I moved carefully, shining my flashlight around. The noise seemed to come from near an old half-buried tree stump. As I got closer, I saw a broken wooden crate partly hidden under leaves and dirt. It was the source of the scraping sound. I was about to look closer when I noticed something strange about the crate. It was covered in what looked like dried mud and old blood. My heart raced. I felt a shiver down my spine as I realized this crate hadn't just been left here, it had been purposely hidden. I pulled at the crate and it came loose with a groan. Inside there was a small rusty metal box. I hesitated but finally opened it. Inside I found old photographs and personal items, most of them with people's faces scratched out or covered up. A chilling feeling washed over me. It was clear this box didn't belong here, and the stuff inside was deeply unsettling. I quickly closed the box and buried it again as best as I could, my mind racing with thoughts. I returned to the tent, trying to stay calm and not wake Mark. The next morning, I packed up our stuff, eager to leave the place. I didn't tell Mark about the crate. I thought it was better not to scare him. We left the campsite without any trouble, and the drive back was quiet. As I looked back at the forest from the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had uncovered something deeply disturbing. It wasn't just the crate or the strange noise, it was the unsettling thought that whatever was hidden in that box was meant to stay buried. The forest seemed to watch us as we drove away, like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to leave. I couldn't escape the sense that we had been watched, and that we had left something behind, something that didn't want to be found. The unease lingered long after we were gone, and I knew that whatever we had stumbled upon was still out there, waiting in the shadows.